Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give 30 seconds to let everybody join. So just get everything set. If you have any questions or issues, please submit to the question box. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion, Transforming the Narrative on Latino Populations, When and How to Use Comparison Groups in Research. My name is Lorena Aceves. I'm a research scientist at Child Trends working with the Hispanic Center in supporting its building capacity efforts. We're excited to have you here to join us today. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to go over some logistics. To make sure that the audio is clear, attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, you can type in questions for the panelists in the question box. We will be monitoring these throughout our discussion, and when possible, respond in the chat box. We will select as many questions as possible to pose to the panel during the question and answer segment. And finally, the webinar will be recorded and available on our website in the coming weeks. We want to continue to build our community of scholars and practitioners focused on Latino families through social media. So if you are on Twitter, please get your phone and use the QR code to share this webinar with your networks. And we invite you to follow us on Twitter using our Twitter handle @NRCHispanic. And an important note that the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views of our funder, the Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation, the Administration for Children and Families, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today, we will be engaging in a conversation about a topic that has been very prominent in the Center's discussions around our research, which is whether and how to make group comparisons by racial and ethnic groups versus centering the research on Latino populations. We believe that this is important to be thoughtful about these decisions, especially as we want to consider the implications of each approach in terms of recognizing the diversity of Hispanic population research, but also in terms of highlighting the strengths of Latino populations and conducting equitable and responsive research. The way we design and approach research with Latino populations can help us move beyond white-centric research that has dominated the field. Furthermore, failing to consider the appropriateness of each approach may lead us to astray in how we interpret the data and make policy implications. Therefore, the webinar will present some goals that we are going to consider. The first is considerations of when it is appropriate to implement comparison groups. Second, how to thoughtfully center the Latino experience. And finally, how to use these approaches to capitalize on the strengths of Latino children and families. So with that, I am delighted to introduce our amazing panelists who are joining us today and bring their professional and personal experiences to today's discussion. In alphabetical order, first we have Dr. Gaby Barajas-Gonzalez, which is an assistant professor at the Center for Early Childhood Health Development in the Department of Population Health at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Second, we have Dr. Cynthia García Coll, who is an adjunct professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Puerto Rico, Medical Science Campus. She is also a Charles Pitts Robinson and John Palmer Barstow Professor Emerita at Brown University. And finally, Dr. William Lopez, who is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and a faculty associate in the Latino-Latina Studies program at the University of Michigan. Thank you all for joining us. We're thrilled to have you with us and excited to hear your thoughts on this topic. So first, we start by welcoming you, and we're so excited to hear how your personal and professional background has contributed to how you decide about looking at comparison groups. So how do you decide whether to examine differences by racial and ethnic group versus centering the Latino experiences when you're first conceptualizing a study? Bill, what is your approach?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Dr. Aceves and others for joining us today. We can't see the faces of the audience, but I heard there was lots of RSVPs, so it's great to have so many people interested in this discussion. So briefly, again, my name is Dr. William Lopez. My field is public health. My research specifically looks at the health impacts of law enforcement, but specifically I look at immigration raids. So my book, Separated Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid, looks at the impact of an immigration home raid that happened a few miles from where I'm sitting. What I wanted to do in this book is take a deep dive into how a raid, a particularly common type of law enforcement violence that much of the US doesn't know about, can deeply impact Latino families and ultimately my or our Latino community. Since then, I began to work also on immigration worksite raids, similar in scope to immigration home raids, but on a much bigger scale. So to the question, how do I decide whether to focus on comparison groups or to center the Latino experience? I think I go back to my discipline. My discipline in public health is all about thinking about systems of injustice and systems of power and privilege. And I do believe I can tell a rich story about the Latino position, but that's often only possible if I'm also considering the systems that oppress us and cause us to be separated from our families. Sometimes that involves careful consideration of a comparison group, which I'll give an example of later. But often, by the nature of understanding the oppressed and who is oppressing them, I have to consider the systems that are oppressing our people. And that isn't always a racial comparison, though sometimes it is. So in short answer, the way I decide is thinking about what systems cause us to experience our health and to shorten our lifespans and experience our health differentially from other populations. Thanks so much, Dr. Ceres.
What about you, Gabby? How do you approach this question?
Yeah, so hi everyone, I am Gaby Barajas-Gonzalez. I am a developmental psychologist. I grew up in California. My parents are immigrants from Jalisco, Mexico. They went to 2nd grade and 6th grade. So I'm a first-gen high school graduate, college graduate, etc. And I've been wrestling a lot with that question and just thinking about, sorry, I'm getting a pop-up saying that my internet is slow. I might have to turn off my camera. I really think it depends on the research question. So what I have found just in my experience is that if I want to look at, for example, whether or not there's disparity in the distribution of, say, the COVID CARES Act, right, relief efforts to go out to the US population to support with regards to COVID. If you want to see, for example, whether or not that's reaching all communities equitably, you would want to look across different populations. But then I think for understanding mechanisms of the way things work, or if you're trying to understand the way specific cultural components work. For example, in one of the studies that I've worked on, led by Dr. Esther Calzada, she really wanted to look at the impact of culture on parenting in the Latino community. So there are specific cultural aspects, such as respeto, that may not apply in other groups. So it would make no sense to see how that construct, which in measuring it was created within the Latino community, it would be kind of weird to try to impose that into another group. So I think that, like, just so that my cheat sheet would be like, if you want to understand or if you want to study whether or not there are disparities, I would do across. But then if I want to understand mechanisms for the disparity, I would look within. Another example is in New York City, I know that there was a hotline for people who had COVID and needed food because they had no food. And so the Latino community was not able to access this hotline equitably because while there was Spanish language assistance, there was no language assistance in some indigenous language of people from Latin America. So like there wasn't assistance for people who speak Mixteco, or it was harder for people who speak primarily Mixteco to access the services. So I think there, you know, you really have to understand within the community the diversity as to like what barriers may exist to accessing a service. So these are just some examples that I've seen in the studies that I've come across.
Mhm.
And what about you, Cynthia? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think both Bill and Gabriela have hit a lot of the important points. It really depends on what question you're asking, right? Whether you have to have comparisons, groups and stuff like that. I'm Cynthia García Coll. I'm from Puerto Rico originally, spent 36 years in the US and did everything that I had to do in one life, and then moved back here in 2011, and I'm recreating a second life. So I'm speaking from Puerto Rico right now. When I came in as a developmental psychologist to the field, you would see that people would use these categories as well. Prof. and Vernon used to talk about social categories, right? And they would compare them, and then they would not measure processes, and then they would come up with a description from whatever the theoretical framework could be. It could be genetics, it could be cultural, it could be deprivation, whatever it was their general framework, they would use and interpret the data without really looking at what other differences were between the groups. So you would be, sometimes you would see, oh, blacks are not good at this because, and it would be a white middle class a group with a poor black inner city group compared. And so what we had to do at that point in the field was really push this notion that there had to be a comparison group. There had to be, and still I hear from some of my colleagues that when they try to publish something with one group, if it's not a white middle class group, why are you doing this? How come you So in my own work, I mostly study within groups. So I would look at within Puerto Ricans, within Dominicans, not even Latinos. I mean, Latinos for me was a census group, right? That was imposed on us, right? It included at the very beginning Portuguese. Who knows what Latino means and stuff like that. And from the three groups that we represent here that, the diversity is so huge that using that rubric of Latino really murks things up. So I've always studied Dominicans, Cambodians, Puerto Ricans, go into depth into the culture and really try to understand within, and then maybe do some comparisons later on controlling. So I've used AdHealth, which gives you a completely different, or some of the national data sets that really talk about Latinos only, but really try to contextualize, even if I am comparing those groups, as both of you said, to contextualize the experience. And I think that really both the comparative and the unicultural needs to coexist. I mean, I think that the best way is to have, I wrote a book a long time ago that never sold, that it's called Immigrant Stories, that I love. I think like every time I read it, I'm like, such a great book. We did both. We looked at Cambodians, Dominicans, and Portuguese, and then we created models that we look at them. So that would be my answer.
Thank you all for sharing your perspectives on that first question. It seems like you all have like interesting and unique lived experiences and also unique experiences in your professional career. So that's pretty awesome to hear where you're coming from and how that connects to this conversation. So next, I'd like for us to discuss what do we gain and what do we lose with each approach. So we're talking about racial ethnic comparisons versus centering the Latino experience. Gabby, I'd like for you to start us out.
I'll go with what you gain first. So I think what you gain is just a better understanding of mechanisms and processes. And I work in areas that create programs to support communities. So then also it's just disseminating in a way that makes sense within the community. So you get just better fit when you work within and when you have a community informed approach. What you lose potentially, just I'm thinking about limitation sections. They're always like, what's your limitation? And it's like generalizability, right? Like, anytime there's some qual involved, it's like you lose the generalizability. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that what you're learning does not apply, but until you test it, you're not sure. I was able to do a study with looking at immigration threat. That's one of the things that I look at to see the way that immigration threat is associated with mental health in the Bangladeshi immigrant community. And I went in there as the daughter of like Mexican immigrants in a mixed status household. Like I grew up with immigration threat. I had an understanding, a lived experience of it. And in hearing from my colleagues and from the participants from the Bangladeshi community, whereas, for example, in the community I grew up with, which was mostly Mexican American, we just talk about it. It's a very natural thing to talk about papers, to talk about the way that somebody's legal status may or may not affect them. But what I heard is that in the Bangladeshi community, you don't talk about it. There's a lot of silence for many different reasons. And I was kind of like, wow, think about how terrible my implications or my discussion section would have been if I had been like, you know, just talk about it more. That totally would not fit within that community. And so I think that when you go within, you get a better understanding, and I think you're able to craft implications and programs that would fit best with that community. What was the second part? I'm sorry, I totally lost it. What do you lose?
Yeah, you talking about what do you gain, now talking about what do you lose.
Yeah, I guess I would say generalizability and also maybe cost efficiency, which unfortunately when you're balancing like the needs of grants and stuff, sometimes it's not as cost efficient, but that's that.
What about Bill? What about you, Bill? What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to think, you know, I want to encourage folks to think about each of these as different tools to accomplish different goals. And these are not only academic goals, but they're also advocacy and political goals, right? So I think what we gain by having both of these is being able to talk about our work in different ways to different people. Sometimes, you know, I know we need the comparison group to make a scientific argument, and this is critical. The gold standards, this is often a comparison. We often have to do that to get our papers published. And for those of you out there, many of you will have to do it to get your dissertation chair to approve. That's great. You have to do it, right? It's part of the consideration. But we've also seen that sometimes the public doesn't care about science, right? And we need to tell a different kind of story. And it's by using the strengths of each of these that we're able to talk both to the scientific community and to our political community, sometimes which doesn't align with us, right? We need different types of tools for these different audiences. So I'm going to stick with that and thinking about the strengths of having both approaches and being able to leverage different narratives towards different ends, ultimately for the strength of and health of our people.
And Cynthia, what are your thoughts?
Yes. So, you know, I think that we've come to a point where we know that mixed methods is the best approach, right? That we can standardize some things, but also qualitative data, stories telling particular cases, give you a sense of the depth of the phenomena, right? You can put some numbers out there, but then you can go into, and I want to go back to my book with, you know, where we created case vignettes from the different ethnic groups to be able to figure out how would it look, how does it look, this looks for a 6th grader Dominican, and how does it look for a 2nd grader, you know, Cambodian? What does life look like? And I think that being able to do that now, Bill, you brought the point of political and what gets published and what gets funded. And that is a reality that we all have. I say to people, you know, do what you need to do to get tenure, okay? And sometimes that's a hard thing for people to listen to because they want to do the study of their lives, you know, like right out of the dissertation. And I'm like, you know what, you're at that point, need to publish. So you need to learn the culture of the journals that you're looking. Culture, I mean, culture is everywhere. It's not in the people that we study, it's among us, it's in academia and stuff like that. So I feel like the strengths and weaknesses of each one, of each way of going, emic versus etic, is a function of the question, but also getting published and getting funded at the time in your career when you have to. And, you know, I mean, I didn't do comparisons at the very beginning, but I did a lot of other studies that were not necessarily exactly what I wanted to do, because I needed to be able to be in the power structure of academia. I'm very political. You know, academia has its politics as any other human endeavor. It's not an ivory tower. And that politics and policies and stuff like that, you need to be aware. And, you know, I say to my students, if you're going to publish, if you want to publish on the top, we all want to publish on the top, so go for the top. Study the journal and figure out how you're going to tell the story based on what you're doing for that particular journal. And then we'll get from there. So get published. I mean, what I'm saying right now is, especially at the very beginning, after you get tenure, that you can do whatever you want in life, which is a great privilege of being in academia.
Well, you all had really great answers for this question, but this actually brought a follow-up to my mind. So y'all brought different interesting points of views. So what are things that we can do to help push funders and maybe like journal reviewers to think about not have, like when we're doing this research that is based on comparison groups, on also valuing that is Latino centered? What are your thoughts on how we can kind of move the needle on that?
Mm-hmm.
Bill, if you want to start us off.
Sure. Yeah, I think going back to what Cynthia said, I think that advice is great, right? So study the journal, what you want to publish in, if that's what you need for your career, and that's certainly strategically what I do often. I imagine there's a lot of non-tenure track folks on the call too, and even centers, right, who are kind of working toward a different type of agenda. And I think there's a couple of things to think about then. So first, going back to publishing in the high-tier journal, for those of us, and this isn't myself since I'm clinical, who need this as part of our careers, I like to encourage folks to think of that publication like not as the peak of the development of the idea. So not the academic poster at the conference and then the discussion at the conference and then the journal, but as the start of the public conversation, right? So the academic piece is out, and then can you podcast or can you blog? Or can you, and there's many different ways to get into the public, right? So I really like to think of, even if I'm doing comparative, even if I'm doing quantitative, and even if it feels very reductive, right? And the work that we don't want to do, there's ways to set ourselves up outside of that rigid academic structure to tell a much bigger story. In answer to your question, Lorena, about how we can push our funders, I think that that's also great. And I think part of it is showing the often public appeal of things outside of the rigorous academic language, the public appeal of things that are much more digestible, often rooted in our academic work. This has been one of the places that I like to push the most, is that rigorous science and solid methodology can coexist with something that the public really wants to hear about, right? And I think the more we're able to do that kind of daringly as academics and put our work out in different ways, the more organizations will see that we can rely on this, right? So the storytelling aspect of all types of work is an essential component of doing good science.
That's great, Bill. What about you, Gabby? What are your thoughts?
No, I'm sitting here nodding with what Bill said. I completely agree. I'm not on the tenure track, so part of which I find very liberating, especially in the pandemic and with the world kind of being what it is. Like the thought of having to do something because it means something is and I recognize my privilege in being able to say this. Like I've been liberated from that mentally. Like I find the work I do so rewarding that because I'm doing it the way I feel works with the communities I work with, because they tell me, because they show up, because we're smiling when we do the work, even though it's heavy. And so at some point, I think in the pandemic, I have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. When the pandemic started, they were 3 and 5, and I was trying to write, do qualitative analysis about the experience of moms worried about being separated from their kid. Like that messed up my mental health. It like no dormía. I wasn't sleeping, right? I have my own kids. I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm like being a angry mom because it was a lot. And so I kind of let go of some things as far as like what I thought things should look like, to really just be able to care for myself, for my kids, and the things I care about. And so part of that has also been like the idea that I have to like do certain things to get in a certain place in academia, which I thank the Lord for, that I've gotten to this place. So I think it just depends on being able to show, I don't even know if it's that you want to show the value of the work, but also to show that there are missed pockets or different ways to advocate and to engage communities. So what I mean by that, for example, is that one of the papers that we published, we found an association between parents' report of immigration threat and child anxiety in pre-K. And we also found an association with self-regulation in pre-K. So like, if you think about developmentally what it means with, if you're in pre-K, if you're a pre-K child and you have this sort of, you're impacted by immigration threat. And mind you, the families were not necessarily all legally vulnerable. It's just that the way that we talk about Latinos and about immigrants has been so, it's so racist. That children were not feeling safe. In pre-K, if we think about developmentally what that means, it's really, I think, such an important missing part to understanding Latino child development and academic outcomes and lots of things. But it got picked up by the LA Times in Español y La Opinión, but not English-speaking media. So I was actually really happy to see a headline that says like discriminación en los niños asociado con la salud mental, because we never, or we rarely discuss in the community the impact of discrimination on child's mental health. And so it was so exciting to see it out there in Spanish. So maybe it didn't get as much buzz in English, and maybe for some metrics of tenure and promotion, this wouldn't be a big deal. So it's kind of like, it's kind of, and I'm privileged to be able to say that I'm following sort of where I feel my energy is useful, because I don't have that much energy anymore. Like before, I had energy to do like the checklist for like this lane and the stuff on the side, my side, like the stuff I love. And now it's just like, it has to be one and the same, and I'm slower and more purposeful. But I think that keeps me here in academia longer. And I don't know what that means yet. But.
Lorena, I've been listening to both of them and empathizing with the fact that they have children at home, a pandemic, you know, the gas going, you know, crazy, the gasoline and everything else. And I forgot the question. What was the question?
No worries, I was going to repeat it for you anyways. So how do we push the needle on like getting our funders and our peer reviewers to understand that there is value in not just doing the ethnic racial comparisons, but also focusing?
So my own approach was, and I still think about it, this is a matter of power, right? This is a matter of power. Who has the power to decide, as Bill said, what is good science, right? And so early on in my career, I decided, okay, so there's an organization that I care about, which is the Society for Research in Child Development, and foundations that I think are doing the good thing, like WT Grant and Foundation for Child Development. And so what I did personally was to think about, we need to get into position of power in that structure, okay? And that's what I meant, you know, if you have tenure, you can do that. If you don't care, I was, for my first 10 years of my career, I was in a non-tenure position too. And then I moved into a tenure position because that's what it really kept me. I had 3 small children at home. So something had to go, and that was the tenure clock. So, you know, I'm always saying we need to think about funders and the government and the foundations and who decides tenure, not as that system out there, but that system that we need to get integrated into, that we need to become the reviewers, that we need to become the journal editors, that we need to become, if we're in an academia, that we need to become the head of the foundation, right? That we need to be the chair of the board of directors of something, that we need to become deans, that we need to, and not all of us, okay? Some of us are saying, forget it, I just want to do research and that's all I do. But some of us wants to be activists within our communities, and I don't know how I managed to also be an activist in a community, in my community in Providence. We need to really think about how we're gonna push the power structure to learn this. And to the argument is, it's a scientific argument. This is good science, okay? This is good science. This is valid science. This is science that is responsive to the ground, doesn't think about child development of public health without a context. Context is alive and kicking, and we need to learn how to measure that context. And so for me, the main issue is, how do we get to become the top? How do we become part of the decision making? So I urge people to volunteer for reviews. You know, I know it's a pain in the neck to do reviews, but at the very beginning, you learn a lot about how science works. You see the difference in opinions and how things. You need to become part, you know, there's a lot for emerging scholars and for students to be volunteering, and I know it's another one, but you choose strategically. I always work with SRCD. I didn't become APA, blah, blah, blah. My North was SRCD. And my North was developmental psychology and child development, right? And those were the ones that I chose to be part of, and those were the ones that I lead at some point. And it all balances it out. And then the beauty of becoming part of the power structure is the horrors of the power structures are going to be deadly, but you need to have community of scholars. And so that's why we created the caucuses at SRCD, so we could have like-minded minds that whenever the things got really heated and really bad, you had a community yourself. I mean, this is not the Lone Ranger, this individual thing, you know, that the US was based on, was great at the very beginning. Now we need to network, we need to support each other, and we need to be there for each other. And so my sense is that we are right. We have the good definition of what knowledge should be about, how knowledge should be used, and we just need to become part of the power structure so that becomes mainstream.
Thank you for that very powerful response, Cynthia. You're really making me, well, all of you are making me think about outside the box about how to, you know, communicate our research and think about how we can make an impact even when we don't think we're making an impact. So I'm going to move into our next question, which is focused on dissemination. So thinking about, you know, this research on comparison groups or focusing on Latinos, how do we ensure that we communicate our research findings from a strengths-based perspective? Bill, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, how do we communicate our research findings from a strength-based perspective? Oh, that's such a good question. I'm still shocked by something, Gabriela, you said, something that you said that stuck with me, that you appreciate the privilege of not being on the tenure track. I'm not usually in spaces where I hear that, and now there's a peer here, and I really appreciated that because I'm often not as public with that, but I feel very much the same way. Like I know which systems I really want to change, and I'm thankful that people like Cynthia are struggling to change the academic system so that people, perhaps like me, perhaps like Gabriela, can focus on another system, right? I think ultimately the strength of our community is being able to have power in the academic system so that we can have power in the political system. And I love that. And I love seeing tenure track and non-tenure track as a team rather than two very competing and different ways of life. I really appreciated that. To Lorena's question, a strengths-based approach. Yes, so I'll give a little bit of a different answer. One of the things in looking at the immigration system, and specifically at immigration worksite raids, which are these massive efforts of well choreographed chaos in our communities, right? Removing dozens upon dozens of people. And this is systemic, like there's millions of dollars that go into this. And the book I'm working on right now is talking about how we respond as a community to these massive efforts to separate us and remove people we love. And it's kind of twofold thinking about the strengths. One is that we are able to survive and thrive despite these systems persecuting us. But the other is really making this argument that, can you imagine what we'd be able to do with these strengths if we weren't perpetually trying to survive and keep people together, right? Do you know how much creativity goes into, for example, getting people out of detention? Like, we saw ride shares, we saw teachers coming together, we saw food pantries popping up. What if we didn't spend our energy there and we were instead able to be the academics and the artists that we want to be, right? So I'm very clear when I talk about the strengths that we have in surviving, that I would rather use those strengths in thriving and creating elsewhere. And then an essential part of taking down these systems of oppression is to be able to use these strengths in different systems altogether.
That's a great response, Bill. Thank you. Gabby, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with Bill's response. I'm going to go back a second only because I'm thinking that we can use this space to also like just talk about things and demystify things. So, and I guess I'm speaking to grad students or people who don't, or I didn't understand all of this, but each different type of school, so if you're at a med school versus a school of social work versus a school of ed versus the undergrad, have different structures for their faculty. And so like, the med school, I think 80% of faculty are not tenure track. Like here, it's a very small percentage that is tenure track. But in other settings, people are tenure track. And so I guess and I didn't know that for the longest time. I was like, oh my gosh, you because we don't have, or because I didn't have enough spaces in which to learn about what it would be like to be in academia or an assistant professor, I didn't know that there were actually different models for being a researcher. And so part of it is just, I think our community just needs to know everything and as transparently as possible. So I'll go back to that. But yeah, right, like it's nice to hear that there's different pathways to being able to do what we want to do, and that we're privileged to be able to choose the pathway that makes the most sense for us. So a strengths-based perspective, this one I struggle with a lot because I'm so focused on highlighting the adverse impact of the macro on the individual. So it's really hard for me to then end it in a positive way. So I think for me, the strengths-based perspective comes in the process. Really using things that are just natural and communal to when we get together, such as storytelling, to really be able to dig into phenomena that we're experiencing. And I don't know why when Bill was talking, I just thought about like the lack of ethnic studies and the lack of knowing our people's history. And so, and sort of like the energy that goes into recreating that over and over and over again for us to know that like actually we have all these strengths in the community, but there's so much effort to erase them, to silence them, that they don't carry on from generation to generation easily. We have to rediscover them over and over. And so again, I forgot the specific question, Lorena, which was highlighting a strength space. I think when I look at quantitative, if people are like, you know, if people are at 50 out of, you know, if you're looking at T-scores, for example, and 50 is the norm, like it's always like a point to say like, despite all of these things, the majority of the population is actually at the average level, which is, you know, speaks to resilience in the community. That said, you know, resilience can only take you so far, and then talk about how over time there's so many more risk factors that we contend with that ultimately harm rather than support our community.
And Cynthia, what are your thoughts about communicating or research in a strengths-based perspective?
So when I was a graduate student, everything that I read about what we call now minoritized populations were all about their deficits. You know, even if most teenage mothers were white, what we knew was about Black and Latino teenage mothers, right? And so that was the norm in the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, okay? And we had to take down that whole structure of comparative, non-in-depth and deficit-oriented research was sort of the norm, right? And so let's talk about 1990 to now, 30 years later. At least when you say strength-based, everybody knows what you're talking about, right? I mean, we've come a long way in theoretical ways or in measurement ways, and we have to give ourselves some, you know, pat on the back for doing that. For me, strength-based means not necessarily the individual, because I always think about individuals within context. So I'm very Brunfenberian. You know, I was a kid on the block when he was standing there talking, and it was like, oh my God, he's absolutely, forget about this personality, individual stuff, and everything else. So for me, it's relational and contextual. What are the relationships that you have as a child, in a family, as a community? What are the social relations that are giving you the context so you can be empowered to be the best that you can, right? What about the culture? So we've talked about familismo, and we've talked about, you know, our togetherness, our, you know, our notion of togetherness and everything else, family obligations. I mean, all of these things, familismo and family obligations can be a double sword, right? Is that how you call it? Double-edged sword? Yeah. Because, you know, you can have a great family, it is wonderful familismo, but when you have a dysfunctional family, you know, what are you going to do about familismo? So really, for me, is the intersection between the individual and this particular context where the strength comes from. So it's the fit, it's the goodness of fit, a very active child in a context where activity is seen as something positive, or a passive child where quietness, not looking at the eyes, being quiet in the corner, you know, not saying, I mean, I used to have a refrain that los niños hablan cuando las gallinas mean. So kids only talk when hens pee. Have you ever seen a hen peeing? You know, I have hens here. I haven't yet. So, you know, those are cultural concepts, but you have to really think about strength as the intersection of relationships, context, and the person. And really not think about it. I have a hard time with resilience as something that is a resilient child or resilient family that comes from within. I think it has to be measured, and I'm excited that we have huge computers and huge models that we can measure everything in the world, because before we used to have an X and a Y, and that was it. So we've come a long way. Just giving a little historical.
Thank you all for all your insightful responses. And we can all admit that an hour is not enough time to discuss this very rich topic and all the different experiences and insights you all have. But it is time to move into the audience Q&A. So I will be looking up the questions that have been coming from our audience. And if they are directly to one of the panelists, I will let you know. And if not, then it's open to any of the panelists to jump in to answer the question. So the first question we have actually is for you, Cynthia. As an editor of child development, how are you able to push the needle in terms of valuing research that focuses on a specific subgroup?
Yeah, I mean, I became an editor of developmental psychology for 6 years and child development for 6 years, not because I like editing, right? Let's put it that way. No. Somebody had to do it, right? Somebody had to break through what I call, it's not a glass ceiling, it's a concrete ceiling for some of us. My glass is easily broken in a certain way. What I did was my statement, my editorial statement, my proposal to SRCD to be an editor was very explicit about doing these paradigm shifts, because these are paradigm shifts. And we are the creators of paradigm shifts right now. We are the movers and the shakers to moving on. My editorial board represented all continents in the world. I made a specific thing of saying, you know what? This is not US, this is not first world, this is not the big C or little c, whatever they're called, you know, countries. This is the world, and I need to make a statement from the very beginning. So I had people from Australia, from also China, Hong Kong, depending on the years. And like that. So what you do is you move in and you look at your power structure. Who's going to be making the decision? And that was the associate editors were being the first, you know, way, me and the associate editors. So I had to be sure that those associate editors were in line with what I wanted. I invited everybody and anybody who wanted to volunteer to be a part of the reviewer system, and also the consulting editors, which are reviewers that are do a lot more, were also chosen. So that was it. I mean, I basically looked at the structure and looked at how is the decision making done, and then I had the power at the very end to look at, you know, if I had agreed. I mean, being a senior editor is a powerful position, and it should be something that we all should strive to be there.
Thank you, Cynthia, for answering that question. So the next question is open to all panelists. So this audience member says, it is obvious to me that the differences in Hispanic groups by culture need to be taken into account when designing one's sampling design. Would you say this is accurate? And what are some considerations to keep in mind at the conceptualization stage?
Gabby and Bill, I talked already. Stamp it up.
So I got tripped up on Hispanic groups by culture. So I'm wondering.
Latinos versus Mexican, Puerto Ricans, Cubans.
I understand they're talking about national, like the national. Yeah. Okay. So the thing that I'm appreciating and learning more over time is that to be Mexican American in the U.S., it's really like the experience itself is like geographically located, contextually time-wise located. Like there's all of these things to think about. And so then and here's where I'm thinking from. So I grew up in California in like a community that was like pretty much 50% Mexican American and 50% non-Mexican white. And then I moved to the East Coast. So my vision growing up was like, los Latinos son los Mexicanos, right? Like everyone who's, you know, Latinos are Mexicans, because I didn't meet different types of Latinos until I came out here for grad school to New York, to the East Coast. And that was like, but boom, like we even have different words for beans in Spanish, right? Like frijoles, habichuelas, like blew my mind. Like even beans have different words in Spanish, different names. And so I guess it really depends on what you want to understand as to how you draw your sample. So if you are trying to understand how a cultural phenomenon develops in two groups, you're probably thinking about those two groups because you're recognizing that their country of origin has a certain particularity to it, the context of reception has a certain particularity to it, and then the time in which you're looking at it has a certain particularity to it. So those are sorts of the things that I think about now when I think about like, why would I need to compare two groups, even within, right? So like how do I need to sample within to capture X? So I worked on an amazing study. It's a developmental study of Mexican and Dominican born children in New York City. And so there, the thinking behind that was that this has been an established context of reception for Dominican children and a newer context of reception for Mexican children, right? And so when you have two Latino immigrant groups, but they're coming from different contexts and they have different histories, how does that impact their schooling during the first years? So really thinking about the population from all of these perspectives as far as why you're looking at them is, I think, some sort of stuff that might help when you're designing your study or what you're thinking about. The other thing I think is really important, especially when you're understanding developmental outcomes with Latinos, is that different Latino groups tend to be overrepresented in certain legal policies. And I didn't understand that for a long time, but you'll see that certain groups have TPS, other groups don't qualify for temporary protected status. And so when immigration policies are being renewed or not renewed, or TPS is being challenged, that's going to impact certain groups more than others. And there's so many different ways that the Latino community is impacted broadly, and then also by country that also matters.
Bill, you want to, or I'll just say a couple of things.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Either way, sure. So I think, Gabby, a lot of your experience sounded like mine. I heard a lot of I grew up in Texas, right, where we say the border crossed us, and then I came to Michigan, in which the immigration experience was quite different, and there were many more folks who had recently arrived. So it's also not a border state in the same way that Texas was. So I learned that deportation was way more about the police and running a stop sign often than it is about the literal border patrol and in your community. So it was eye-opening for me as well. The thing that Gabby hit all the points I wanted to make. The thing that I'll add is I often push myself to think about how in the academy we can draw rich differences in between our communities, but sometimes in the advocacy world we need to come together as an even larger community, right, instead of smaller subsets. When I look at the immigration home raid that I wrote about, as I mentioned, these home raids were perfected, right, by the police in Black communities during the war on drugs, and are tested out and refined and also used in Latino communities. So what we really need is this Black and Brown solidarity against a large state violence, right? So while it is critical, and while I do believe in being able to subsample very particularly to know more about our history as subgroups within the Latino community, it's also really important to be able to come together across those racial differences in the advocacy that we do as well. Thanks. Cynthia, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
I'm going to move on to another question just so that we can keep answering as many as possible. So another question from the audience that Cynthia, you can chime in. Looking for thoughts on the appropriateness of controlling for race in quantitative research, especially when the minoritized sample is small.
Oh God, controlling for race. Somebody else take it, because I'm off the deep end on that one.
I can start. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Well, I basically control for very little of my studies. I basically look at the contribution of many variables, and I think that I don't even know how to start saying what is race as a social construction. When you were saying, Bill, right now, the brown and Black, we need to unite. To a certain extent, that's been my sort of academic and political. That's why I've always used the word minority. When we published early on in the 90s talking about minorities, people were saying, like, don't use that word because that's a deficit model. And I was saying, you know what? I use that word because that is the reality of people's life. People are put in that category of minority. Nobody chooses to be there, unless we migrate and stuff like that. So my sense was that I never look at racial differences. And, when this webinar came in, I was saying to myself, I wonder if someday we should start looking at racial differences, for example, within Latinos. A self-ascribed racialized skin color or something like that. But I basically do not control for many things. I try to put my variables into some explanatory constructs and really think that every single one of these categories, race, gender, sexual orientation, all of them gives you a little bit more of understanding of the person's experience, the intersectionality of gender and race and all of these other variables are for me important. So I never control for anything. I try to make sense of what comes out. Should we take another one?
Yes. So how do you balance the need to look at within group comparisons with the burden of collecting too much data from participants?
That's a good one. It's a good one. Yes, I mean, I try when I get funded, I put a lot of money for my families. You know, I think it's respectful and it's fair to involve, you know, my families. You know, in my 3 immigrant groups, the big study that I was talking about in the book, we were Cambodians, Dominicans, and Portuguese. And, you know, we had 7 or 8 hours of conversations with the parents, and we just divided it up. We had the flexibility sometimes if they didn't want, sometimes we needed interpreters, especially with the Cambodian community. And so we really go out of our way to make people realize what, how much they're giving us and how respectful we are of their time and stuff like that, and really try to make it as comfortable and try to, you know, give them some sort of compensation that usually is very little for what they do. And as you say, Gabby, I mean, we laugh. I mean, even if we're talking about painful stuff, we become part of, you know, part of a system of information exchange that and of affect and you know, of caring that really, I mean, if you do, you know, just not looking at their eyes or, you know, not creating a relationship, I think that that's the best way of thinking about it. You create a relationship. I don't want to silence anybody, stop me.
I was going to say, I think the other thing that's really important and that's progressing is measurement being better so that questions feel more relevant to the communities you're talking to. And so this is just in general, like if you're participating in a survey and most of the questions either don't make sense or don't feel relevant, like that feels more burdensome than if you're actually being engaged in a way that things feel relevant to you. And so I found that that people don't mind as much participating when you're asking questions that actually resonate and like they're happy to talk about, even if they're painful things to talk about, but that it's a validation of experience versus questions that, boy, these really are not, don't make sense to me. So I know that's not exactly the question, but I do think that the relevance of the questions and scales and subscales is really important, and we need to put more thought and effort into measuring things within the community that actually resonate. I had the opportunity when I was doing research with educators and families to show Cecilia Yon has Perceived Immigration Policy Effect Scale. She developed it doing lots of qualitative work in Arizona. And when I showed moms I think it's 21 items, tapping into like 4 different constructs about the impact of immigration policies. Like it impacts, you know, children's vulnerability, discrimination, your own mental health, like seeing each item, the parents were like, yes, yes, yeah. And I thought that was really like, wow, it's actually really powerful to see the way we're measuring this and to see that it resonates, right? Like these are all the ways that, like, it's not just that I feel discriminated against, it's that I go to the store y no me ponen atención. It's that I try to get help and there are no resources for me. Like all of the ways, I thought it was really powerful to have that exchange. And so it really made me aware that the measures that we use can also really impact how a participant feels.
And I think, Lorena, if it's okay, one more thing. I can say it in 30 seconds. I think also the value of the questions is in making it beyond the one-time interaction and bringing some of that information back to the community. So those questions are more valuable when they see them again. And you know, this can be presentations at the library. Have we gone back to kids' high schools? Have we shown this on you know, in a newspaper that folks commonly read, right? And it may be totally different from what we're publishing in the academy. We're not showing items and scales. We're showing something that they may associate with more closely. So, you know, I always encourage folks to think about what questions you're asking and what you can bring back to the community in a different way, just to show them that their input was valued and is part of a larger conversation beyond the academic conversation.
Thank you all for your responses. We are out of time. I'd like to thank everybody for attending our webinar today. We ask you to visit our website if you want to see what the Hispanic Center is up to, and to follow us on Twitter. And we'd also like to thank our funders for supporting this work. Thank you all, and a virtual round of applause for our panelists.
Bye. Nice meeting you, Bill. Good seeing
meeting
you,
you all.
Gaby.
Nice learning from both of you again and again and again. I
Yeah,
love
good.
it. Thank you.
I know, it's good.
Thank you,
It's good.
Lorena.
And thanks, Lorena,
Bye.
for the organization.
Thank you all for participating.